My name is Jane Ann Buturff. I'm an assistant principal at Creekland Middle School in Atlanta, Georgia. Our school has 2,300 students ranging in age from 11 to 14. My responsibilities at the school, including managing 730 students in the 7th grade, as well as special education. I do have a master's degree in special education. In the United States, education is a state right. The states determine their own educational policies. However, in 1990, the federal government enacted a law called IDEA, Individual Disabilities Education Act. This law states that any student from birth to age 21 has the right to a free and public education in spite of a disability. According to the Individual Disabilities Education Act, there are 18 categories of disabilities. These include emotional behavior disorder, specific learning disability, 4 levels of autism spectrum, 3 levels of intellectual disability according to IQ and abilities to perform, speech and language disability, hearing impairment, visual impairment, and 3 levels of early childhood disabilities. However, because a child has a disability, he is not automatically guaranteed special education services. It must be determined that the child cannot be successful in school without different or special services within the school system in order to be successful. It is a very lengthy process and a very complicated process to determine if a child has a disability that needs special services. Every child in every classroom in our middle school, for example, is considered in Tier 1 of RTI. RTI stands for Response to Interventions. Every teacher is expected to provide interventions for every student to make that student successful. These interventions might include things such as preferential seating or retaking a test if they had a bad day, giving extra time on an assignment. Every student is entitled to these interventions. Now, if after a few weeks it is determined that the child is struggling academically, then we get together, the teachers, the administrator, the school counselor, and talk about what could make that child more successful. And we move a child into Tier 2 of RTI. Tier 2 consists of more extensive interventions. These might include things such as highlighting special parts of a test, giving a student extended time to take a test above what the other students get. We have a long list of interventions that teachers can use to help a child be more successful. If this, after 4 weeks, does not work, then we hold what we call an SST. A student support team meeting can only take place after 4 weeks of interventions have been in place in what we consider Tier 2 of the RTI process. Those were a little bit more demanding interventions that took place, and a student is not successful, so the SST meeting is held consisting of the school administrator or assistant head, the school counselor, the school psychologist, parents are invited, all of the teachers, and the lead special education teacher. It is a large meeting, and the purpose is to discuss student background and student success or lack thereof so far. A data sheet is filled out. All of the students' state and national test scores are recorded on the data sheet. An academic contract is created or reviewed. It should have been created prior to that point. And everyone discusses whether or not the student needs more weeks of interventions. If it is determined that the student does, then we move to Tier 3 of the process. This is a very lengthy tier. It takes 12 weeks of progress monitoring to determine whether or not a student needs more interventions. Interventions in Tier 3 consists of special classes, such as remedial reading or remedial math, use of calculators or having a test read aloud, and the student is given probes on a weekly basis for 12 weeks in either reading or math to determine the exact level that student is functioning at in those two areas. This would determine a low functioning level. For example, 4th grade reading for a 7th grade student could possibly determine a specific learning disability in reading. If it is determined at the end of the 12 weeks that there's not enough progress being made and that there is the possibility of a special need, a disability, then the parents are again invited back to a second SST along with the psychologist, lead special ed teacher, counselor, teachers, and administrator, and it is then determined whether or not a referral should be made to special education. This entire process to determine whether or not a student has a disability has taken at this point about 18 weeks. 2 weeks to notice a lack of success, 4 weeks during the first 2 levels of RTI, and then 12 weeks during level 3. If a student is referred to special education, the parents have to sign a consent form to have the student tested with a full psychological, which means academic and cognitive screening. From this testing is done by the school psychologist, and the government gives us 60 days from the referral to eligibility to determine whether or not a student has a disability. So we have to be very aware of time constraints when this happens. As you can see, it's very lengthy because we've already spent a half a year, school year, determining whether or not a student is going to be successful in that grade level. Once the psychologist has all of her testing done, an eligibility meeting is held with the parents to look at all the data and determine yes or no a student is eligible for special education services. If it is determined that a student is eligible, then another meeting is held to write an IEP, an individual education plan for that student. Again, the parents, the teachers, the school psychologist, and the special ed lead teacher are at that meeting to set up a plan for the student's needs. An IEP is very detailed and it is valid for 1 year only, in which time another meeting has to be held to renew it. At the end of 3 years, the student goes through what we call a reevaluation process, in which the student is retested to determine if a disability is still there and the student needs special services. A disability remains with the student probably forever. However, at the end of 1 year, another individual education plan is developed for each student because needs change, settings sometimes change, and they need to set new goals for a student. So every year a new IEP is held. Every 3 years we hold a reevaluation to determine if the student still needs special education services. Additional testing is done at that time, and the parents meet with the school psychologist to determine whether or not a student still needs services. Sometimes a student learns to cope with the disability and uses his or her own strategies to be successful in the classroom and no longer needs special education services. We have 250 students, a little over 250 students in our school receiving special education services. These services can be in the form of a self-contained setting, such as an autism class of 10 children taught by one teacher and one assistant, or it can be in a resource setting where a student goes into the regular classroom for maybe 3 subjects and then goes to a special math teacher, resource math teacher, for math for example, maybe 8 or 9 other students. We try to keep those classes at 10 students each. Students could have more than one resource class. They could have 1 to 4 resource classes. A least restrictive environment, which the government mandates, is a co-taught setting in which special ed students remain in the regular classroom, but a special education teacher comes into that classroom every day and helps monitor the needs of the special ed students within that classroom. The least level of services is sometimes a student only needs monitoring, meaning a consultative meeting with a special ed teacher once a week just to check to see how the student is doing. If a student only needs consultation or monitoring, he or she is probably going to not need special ed services in a year or two. Some of our students have a one-to-one relationship with a special education teacher. These students would need orthopedic training or speech and language. We have 3 speech teachers in our school, and they meet with students in either a small group or on a one-to-one basis according to their needs. Currently in our school, we have 10 self-contained classes, 3 speech and language teachers, 18 resource teachers. So we have a large population, but we're serving the students' needs in as many settings as we possibly can.